cannot be explained by radioisotopic dating. Therefore, creationism is true. That is the structure of the vast majority of the explanations in the creationist literature. Keep this diagram in mind because we're going to come back to it. This is a trend that runs through not only creation science, but also intelligent design, and also to the current post Kitzmiller versus Dover world that we find ourselves in today. Now, of course, this is very bad logic, because in order for, if not A, then B, the philosophy majors, you know this kind of argumentation, for that to be true, there must be only two alternatives. And of course, that's not true. Over there on the special creation side, there's more than one alternative. And of course, the most obvious one is the predominant position within Christian theology, which is something called theistic evolution. Now, if any of you went to Catholic schools, the point of view that you learned about creation and evolution is something called theistic evolution, which is, of course, evolution happened. It's the way God created. God created through the process of evolution. It's what Catholics and most mainstream Christians call theistic evolution. But we shouldn't just restrict ourselves to Christianity because, of course, Christianity is only one of the world's religions. There are certainly many other religions on the planet. There are world religions like Hinduism. There also are classical religions. There are tribal religions. There are plenty of religions around the world, each of which have their own explanations. Disproving evolution doesn't prove them any more than disproving evolution proves special creationism. There are far too many possibilities over there on the non-evolution side for you to argue not evolution proves the other side. So the argument falls apart logically as well as falling apart in terms of content. Now, in the late 70s and early 80s, there were efforts to pass equal time for creation science bills in state legislatures. The state of Arkansas passed an equal time bill in 1981, and Judge William Overton oversaw a full trial over whether creation science was a valid science that could be taught in public schools. I want to point out that the plaintiffs in this case were religious leaders. Reverend William McLean was the lead plaintiff in McLean versus Arkansas. This was not a matter of science versus religion. This was a matter of a series of religious leaders. Oh, excuse me. This was a matter. We want to go back. Is there a way for me to get back here? I think there is. What's happening here? Don't go away. Definitely don't go away. There we are. That's right. Somehow it's just watered down the way. We're where we want to be. Presbyterian, United Methodist, Episcopal, Catholic, African Methodist, Episcopal, Southern Baptist. This was 82, before Southern Baptist went off the deep end. This was a large number of denominations that did not want a specific sectarian Christian view to be taught in the public schools because it wasn't their view. Okay, I think that's significant to understand about this this issue of what we teach in the public schools. We want the public schools to be religiously neutral, and teaching creationism in the science class means the public schools are not being religiously neutral, and that was a problem. Now, in the case of McLean versus Arkansas, It was a full trial, which was very interesting. In fact, it's quite parallel to the Kitzmiller versus Dover trial. There was testimony from eminent scientists. Those of you who know Francisco Ayala and Stephen Jay Gould will see very youthful-looking Francisco Ayala and Stephen Jay Gould here. If you know, geologists will know Brent Ulrich. He also looked quite youthful there. The physicists know Hal Morowitz. I looked considerably younger in the early 80s as well, didn't we all? These were National Academy of Science quality, where's that come from? Individuals. Charitably speaking, the witnesses for the creation side were, shall we say, less well known. Probably the best known of the scientists on the creation side was Chandra Wickrama Singh from Great Britain, an astronomer whose testimony actually ended up helping the creation side more than the defense, because he said such things as, anyone who believes that the Earth is young is speaking utter rubbish, which was not very good. The expert witnesses on the creation side ended up making some really quite credibility-damaging statements, and the defense utterly failed to convince the judge that creation science was science, and Judge Overton ruled that the Arkansas Equal Time Law was unconstitutional. A few years later, in 1987, the Supreme Court considered a similar bill from Louisiana and decided that creation science could not legally be taught in public schools. Teaching creationism violated the neutrality toward religion required by the First Amendment, and creation science would never be a mass movement in the schools. Now, in one sense, creationists decided to make lemonade here. There were some important components of the Edwards versus Aguilar decision, and also a dissent by Justice Scalia in that decision, that the creationists seized upon to help, like I say, to make lemonade out of a bad deal. Justice Brennan wrote that the teachers, of course, had a right to teach scientific alternatives to evolution, which of course is certainly true, obviously. If there were scientific alternatives to evolution, of course, teachers could teach them. If there was a scientific alternative to gravitation, to Newtonian gravitation, teachers could teach it. Einstein came up with a scientific alternative to Newtonian gravitation, and teachers can teach it. If somebody could come up with a scientific alternative to evolution, teachers could teach it, but there aren't any. The only alternatives to evolution are religious alternatives to evolution. Of course, the original scientific alternative to evolution was creation science, right? It proved to be not scientific, so that's why we had the trial in McLean, and that's why we had the non-trial. That's why we had the decision in Edwards versus Aguilar. Justice Scalia also, in his dissent, commented that teachers, of course, have the right to teach the evidence against evolution, just like Scopes have the right to teach the evidence for it. Now, a dissent, by the way, is not legally binding. It's just sort of a dissent. But creationists seized upon this with great enthusiasm and started arguing that the Supreme Court says that teachers should be teaching the evidence against evolution. So these two arguments, that teachers should be teaching alternatives to evolution and evidence against evolution, is very important to where we are now. The Institute for Creation Research encouraged just this strategy in a publication immediately after the Edwards decision. They wrote, in the meantime, school boards and teachers should be strongly encouraged at least to stress the scientific evidences and arguments against evolution in their classes. Not just arguments against some proposed evolutionary mechanism, but against evolution per se, even if they don't wish to recognize these as evidences and arguments for creation. Okay? Remember that, the two-model approach? Evidence against evolution is evidence for creation. Okay? So, when you hear the phrase evidence against evolution, think evidence for creation, because that's the way creationists look at this. They believe that when you're teaching evidence against evolution, this is actually a way of slipping in creationism through the back door. Now, even before the Edwards versus Aguilar decision in 1987, at the time of the McLean trial, Creationists had become dissatisfied with creation science, and were looking for a replacement